Empress HFY stood in front of the huge portal that filled the entire wall of her throne room, and her blue skin looked pale and tired after months of bad news from the war front, and dark circles under her eyes showed how little sleep she had been getting lately while her empire crumbled around her, and the mechanical enemies called Devourers kept destroying planet after planet, without mercy or pause, and now only 12 star systems remained from what used to be the greatest empire in this part of the galaxy. The portal was ancient technology that her people barely understood, but the old book said it could bring warriors from across the universe when the empire faced its darkest hour, and HFY had never believed those old stories until now, when she had no choice but to try everything and anything that might save her people from complete destruction and total defeat at the hands of machines that showed no emotion or mercy. General Kyung-soo stood beside her throne, with his hand on his sword and worry written across his face because he had lost 3 more battles this week, and each defeat meant thousands of dead soldiers and abandoned worlds. And he kept telling the Empress that they needed more troops, but where could they find warriors brave enough and strong enough to fight the Devourers, when every other race in the galaxy either hid from them, or joined them, or got destroyed by them? Chancellor So Young held the ancient book that described the summoning ritual, and her voice shook as she read the old words that nobody had spoken for 1,000 years. And the portal began to glow with strange colors that hurt to look at directly, and energy crackled around the edges like lightning during a storm, and the air in the throne room started to smell like metal and ozone, and something else that reminded HFY of her childhood home before the war began. The ritual took 3 hours and required most of the palace power system, and by the time the portal fully opened, HFY felt dizzy from exhaustion and hope and fear all mixed together, because this was their last chance, and if it failed, then nothing could save the Viel-3 Empire from becoming another footnote in history books that nobody would be alive to read, and the light from the portal was so bright that everyone had to shield their eyes. HFY expected armies to march through the portal, and great warriors with weapons and armor and battle cries that would shake the palace walls and inspire her people to fight harder than they had ever fought before. But instead, only one figure stumbled out of the light and fell down on the marble floor with a confused expression and clothes that looked nothing like battle gear. The figure was a human male who appeared to be in his 30s with black hair and ordinary features, and he wore a gray business suit that was wrinkled and a blue tie that was crooked, and he carried a small flat device in his hand. And when he stood up and looked around the throne room, he seemed more annoyed than amazed or frightened, and the first thing he said was not a battle cry or pledge of loyalty, but a question about where he could find coffee. Do-hyun brushed dust off his suit jacket and looked at his tablet, which somehow still worked, despite traveling through dimensions and space and time. And he frowned at the screen because his quarterly reports were due tomorrow, and his boss would be very angry if they were late. And he had no idea how he was going to explain this situation to human resources when he got back to Seoul. General Kyung-soo drew his sword and pointed it at Do-hyun, because he thought this was some kind of trick or insult from their enemies, and his telepathic abilities could sense that this human had no fighting experience and no weapons and no special powers, and he was clearly not the great warrior they had summoned to save their empire. And Kyung-soo wanted to send him back through the portal immediately. Chancellor So Young checked the ancient book again and again, looking for some explanation of why the ritual had brought them only one ordinary person instead of armies of heroes, and her face grew more worried with each page. She turned because the book clearly said that the portal would bring the help they needed most, but this human looked like he belonged in an office building, not on a battlefield. Do-hyun ignored the sword pointing at him and asked politely if someone could explain the situation, because he had been reviewing sales data when everything went white, and now he was in what looked like a palace with blue-skinned aliens who seemed upset about something, and he really needed to understand what was happening before he could help anyone with anything. HFY studied the human carefully with her telepathic senses and discovered that his mind was strange and organized in ways that were completely different from Viel-3 thoughts, and she could not read his emotions clearly, but she sensed intelligence and calmness and something else that reminded her of water flowing around rocks and finding new paths when the old ones were blocked. So Young brought up a holographic display that showed the current state of the war and the locations of devourer fleets in the worlds that had been lost. and the projections that showed complete defeat within 6 months. And Do-hyun studied the data with the same expression he used for quarterly reports and asked several questions about enemy tactics and supply lines and response patterns. The human took notes on his tablet, while the Empress explained how the Devourers had appeared 3 years ago from the edge of the galaxy, and how they converted planets into factory worlds, and how they seemed to learn from every battle and adapt their strategies, and how traditional Veltri warfare based on honor and direct combat had proven useless against enemies who had no sense of honor or fear. Do-hyun listened carefully and asked for more specific data about battle losses and resource allocation and enemy movement patterns, and after an hour of questions he looked up from his tablet and said that he could see several obvious problems with their current approach, but he would need coffee and a quiet place to work and access to their military databases to develop better solutions. General Kyung-soo laughed bitterly and said that this soft human with no weapons and no armor and no understanding of Veltri culture could never help them defeat enemies that their greatest warriors could not stop. But Hae-won held up her hand for silence, because something about Do-hyun reminded her of her grandfather, who had been famous for solving impossible problems by thinking about them differently. The Empress decided to give the human a chance, because they had nothing left to lose, and she assigned him quarters near the war room and gave him access to all their tactical data and promised him the best coffee in the palace, and told her generals to cooperate with him even though she could sense their doubt and anger through their telepathic connections. That night, Do-hyun sat in his new room drinking alien coffee that tasted like earth coffee mixed with cinnamon, and reviewing 3 years of battle reports and casualty lists and strategic analyses, and he began to understand why the Veltri were losing, and it had nothing to do with courage or weapons and everything to do with predictable thinking patterns that their mechanical enemies had learned to exploit. The next morning, he requested a meeting with the War Council, and when all the generals and admirals had gathered, he stood in front of their holographic battle display and said something that shocked them all and made them wonder if the summoning ritual had brought them exactly what they needed, even though it was not what they had expected. Do-hyun stood before the War Council with his tablet in hand and looked at the angry faces of Veltri generals who had been fighting this war for 3 years and losing ground every month, and he could sense their frustration and desperation, even without telepathic abilities, because their body language told the whole story, and their blue skin had a gray tint that showed exhaustion and defeat. The first thing he said was that they were fighting the war completely wrong, and the room erupted in angry voices and telepathic waves of outrage, because these were proud warriors who had won 1,000 battles before the Devourers arrived, and Commander Jin-woo slammed his fist on the table and said that no human could understand Veltri honor and military tradition, and that Do-hyun was insulting their ancestors and their courage. General Kyung-soo agreed with Jin-woo and pointed out that the Veltri had been warriors for 10,000 years, and they knew how to fight, and they had faced many enemies before and always won through strength and bravery and honor. And the problem was not their tactics, but simply that the Devourers had superior numbers and technology and firepower. Do-hyun waited for the shouting to stop and then pulled up a holographic display that showed the last 50 battles, and he pointed to patterns that the Veltri had never noticed because they were too close to see them clearly, and he showed how their enemies predicted every move they made and countered every strategy they tried and always knew exactly where they would attack next. The human explained that the Devourers were machines, and machines were very good at recognizing patterns and learning from repetition, and the Veltri fought with honor, which meant they always did things the same way, and announced their intentions and attacked from the front and never retreated even when retreat would be smarter, and this made them completely predictable to their mechanical enemies. Chancellor So-young asked what Do-hyun suggested instead, and he said they needed to become unpredictable and use tactics that machines would have trouble understanding, and this meant doing things that seemed dishonorable, like retreating and hiding and lying and using tricks and attacking weak spots instead of meeting enemies in fair combat. The War Council was horrified by these suggestions, and Admiral Taemin said that such tactics were cowardly and beneath the dignity of true warriors, and that they would rather die honorably than win dishonorably. And Do-hyun nodded and said, that was exactly the problem, because dead heroes could not protect their people, and sometimes survival was more important than honor. Empress Hae-won had been listening quietly, and she could sense the truth in Do-hyun's words, even though they went against everything her people believed, and she knew that traditional methods were not working, and something had to change or everyone would die, and at least the human was offering solutions instead of just complaints about the situation. The Empress decided to give Do-hyun a small test, and she assigned him to defend the mining colony of Theta 7, which was expected to be attacked within days, and she gave him only 200 soldiers and some mining equipment, and told him to prove that his strange tactics could actually work against real enemies in a real battle. Commander Jin-woo volunteered to observe the defense of Theta 7 because he wanted to see the human fail and prove that traditional Val-3 methods were still the best. And he was sure that Do-hyun would panic when faced with actual combat and run away, or get everyone killed with his foolish ideas about fighting. Without honor, Do-hyun arrived at Theta 7 and immediately began studying the terrain and the mining facilities and talking to the miners about their equipment and asking questions about how the machines worked and what they could do, and the miners thought he was strange, but they liked that he listened to them and treated them with respect. When the Devourer fleet arrived 3 days later, everyone expected Do-hyun to order the defenders to form battle lines and meet the enemy head-on, as tradition demanded. But instead he told them to hide in the mines and let the enemies land unopposed, and this seemed like cowardice to Jin-woo, who was watching from a hidden position. The Devourers sent their ground forces to capture the mining facility, and they moved in perfect formation, scanning for defenders and expecting resistance but finding none, and they began to spread out through the complex following their programming, which told them to secure all strategic positions and eliminate any threats they encountered. Do-hyun had spent 2 days preparing surprises throughout the mining complex, and he had turned ordinary mining equipment into weapons and set up traps in tunnels and rigged explosives in places where the enemies would gather, and most importantly, he had studied how the mechanical soldiers moved and communicated and planned his ambush around their weaknesses. The first surprise came when a squad of Devourers entered the main processing plant and triggered modified mining lasers that had been aimed at the entrance, and the concentrated beams cut through their armor like it was made of paper and destroyed half the squad before they could react or call for help. Then more traps activated throughout the complex, and mining charges exploded under marching columns, and industrial crushers activated when enemy units walked past them, and chemical processing equipment released clouds of corrosive gas that ate through mechanical parts and disabled sensors and communication systems. The Devourers tried to adapt to these attacks, but Do-hyun had predicted their responses and prepared counter traps, and he used the mining facility communication system to coordinate his scattered defenders and keep them moving, so the enemies could never find them or predict where they would strike next. Engineer Mi-young watched from the command center as Do-hyun directed the battle like a conductor leading an orchestra, and she saw how he used every piece of equipment and every tunnel and every worker to maximum advantage, and she began to understand that there were many ways to fight, and honor was not the only path to victory. The battle lasted 6 hours, and when it was over, not a single Devourer remained functional, and the mining colony was saved, and the defenders had lost only 12 soldiers instead of the 200 that traditional tactics would have cost, and even Jin-woo had to admit that the human methods had worked better than expected. Word of the victory spread through the Val-3 fleet faster than official reports, and soldiers began talking about the soft human who had defeated enemies that their best generals could not stop, and some of them started wondering if maybe there was something to learn from his strange ideas about fighting. Do-hyun returned to the capital and found that attitudes toward him had changed, and instead of dismissing him as a weak human, some of the younger officers began asking questions about his tactics and requesting permission to try similar approaches in their own commands, and this worried the traditionalist commanders who saw it as a threat to their authority. The Empress met with Do-hyun privately and thanked him for proving that his methods could work, and she asked him to explain more about human approaches to warfare and problem-solving, and he told her that humans had learned to survive by being adaptable and creative, and using intelligence to overcome stronger opponents. Hai-1 realized that the portal had brought her exactly what she needed, and that sometimes the best solution to a problem came from someone who was not trapped by old ways of thinking, and she began to see that saving her empire might require changing it in ways that would have been unthinkable just a few weeks earlier. The next day, Do-hyun presented a plan for training selected Val-3 officers in what he called adaptive thinking and flexible tactics, and he requested permission to work with volunteers who were willing to learn new approaches to combat and strategy. And the Empress approved his request despite protests from the conservative military leadership. Ma Young was the first to volunteer for the new training program, and she brought a dozen other young engineers and technicians who were excited about the possibility of using their technical knowledge in combat situations, and Do Hyun began teaching them to think like humans instead of traditional Valkyrie warriors. The emergency alarm woke everyone in the palace at dawn, and Admiral Taemin rushed to the command center with reports that the largest Devourer fleet ever assembled was heading straight for the Valkyrie homeworld, and the invasion would begin in less than 48 hours, and this would be the final battle that would decide the fate of the entire empire. Empress Haewon called an immediate war council, and all the generals and admirals gathered around the holographic display that showed the approaching enemy fleet, and the numbers were terrifying because the Devourers had brought enough ships to overwhelm any defense and enough ground forces to conquer the planet, even if every Valkyrie citizen took up arms. General Kyung-soo presented the traditional battle plan that called for gathering all remaining fleet elements around the homeworld and meeting the enemy in glorious combat and fighting to the last ship and the last warrior and dying with honor rather than surrendering or fleeing. And this plan was supported by most of the military leadership. Do Hyun studied the tactical display and the force projections and asked quietly how many civilians lived on the homeworld, and when Chancellor So Young answered that 12 billion Valkyrie called this planet home, he shook his head and said that the traditional plan would result in the complete extinction of their species within 1 week. The human suggested an alternative that made everyone in the room gasp with shock and horror because he recommended evacuating the entire planet and abandoning the homeworld to the Devourers without a fight, and using the saved fleet to continue resistance from hidden bases and mobile operations. And this was the most dishonorable suggestion anyone had ever heard. Commander Jin-woo stood up and his face was purple with rage, and he accused Do-hyun of cowardice and treason, and said that no true warrior would ever abandon the sacred soil where their ancestors were buried and where their children were born, and where 10,000 years of Valkyrie civilization had grown and flourished. The War Council erupted in angry arguments and telepathic waves of outrage and disgust, and many officers declared that they would rather die fighting than live as homeless refugees. And General Kyung-soo said that the human could not understand what the homeworld meant to the Valkyrie people, and what it would cost them to leave it behind. Do-hyun waited for the shouting to die down, and then he asked a simple question about whether dead ancestors would want their descendants to join them in death, or to survive and carry on their memory and their culture and their knowledge to new worlds where future generations could honor them properly. Intelligence Chief Yuna supported the evacuation plan because her scouts reported that the Devourer fleet was too large to defeat in direct combat, and she had seen what happened to other worlds that tried to fight hopeless battles, and the result was always complete annihilation with no survivors to remember the brave dead. The debate continued for hours, and the Empress could feel her people tearing themselves apart over the decision, and she knew that whatever choice she made would haunt her forever, and many of her subjects would never forgive her. But she also knew that Do-hyun was right about the mathematics of survival. As the argument raged, Do-hyun worked quietly on his tablet, and when asked what he was doing, he explained that he was calculating evacuation logistics and transport capacity, and supply requirements and safe rally points and all the practical details that would be needed if they chose to save lives instead of preserving honor. Chief Technician Yoonji approached Do-hyun during a break in the council meeting and asked if he had any other ideas, because she could not bear the thought of letting the Devourers take their homeworld unopposed, and she wanted to find some way to make the enemies pay for their victory even if the Valkyrie had to retreat. Do-hyun smiled and showed her some code he had been writing on his tablet, and explained that computer viruses were a very old human invention, and that machines were vulnerable to malicious software just like biological organisms were vulnerable to diseases, and if they could infect the Devourer network, they might be able to cause serious damage. Yoonji was fascinated by the concept, because Valkyrie technology was based on biological principles and they had never developed anything like computer viruses. But she understood the theory immediately, and began working with Do-hyun to adapt his programs for their enemy systems. The Empress finally called for a vote, and The council was split almost evenly between those who wanted to fight and die with honor, and those who wanted to evacuate and continue the resistance. And Heywan realized that the final decision was hers alone, and whatever she chose would define her reign and her legacy. She thought about her grandfather, who had always told her that a leader's greatest duty was to protect their people, even when the people did not understand what was best for them. And she remembered how he had made unpopular decisions that saved the empire from earlier threats, and she knew what she had to do. Heywan stood up and announced that the evacuation would begin immediately, and that all civilian and non-essential military personnel would be transported to predetermined safe systems, and that only a skeleton force would remain to make the evacuation look like a fighting retreat, and to implement the computer virus plan. The reaction was immediate and explosive, and several officers resigned their commissions, rather than participate in what they saw as cowardly abandonment, and Commander Jin Woo declared that he would stay on the homeworld and fight alone if necessary, and Admiral Tae Min split his forces between those who would evacuate and those who would make a final stand. Do Hyun and Yoonji worked around the clock to finish the virus program and embed it in critical infrastructure systems throughout the planet, and they designed it to remain dormant until the Devourers tried to integrate captured technology into their network, and then it would spread like wildfire through their connected systems. The evacuation took 36 hours and was the largest logistical operation in Vale3 history, and billions of civilians were loaded onto transport ships along with cultural treasures and genetic samples and historical records and everything that could preserve their civilization for future generations. As the last transport ships left orbit, the Devourer fleet arrived and began their assault on what appeared to be a defended world, and the skeleton force put up enough resistance to make the attack look realistic before retreating in apparent defeat, and the mechanical forces claimed another easy victory. The Devourers immediately began converting planetary infrastructure to serve their purposes, and their engineers connected captured power grids and communication networks and manufacturing facilities to their main system, and within hours the virus began propagating through their network faster than their security programs could stop it. The infection caused cascade failures throughout the Devourer fleet, and ground forces lost coordination, and orbital platforms began firing on each other, and manufacturing systems started producing defective equipment, and for the first time since the war began, the mechanical army showed signs of confusion and vulnerability. From her command ship hidden in an asteroid field, Empress Heywan watched the chaos spreading through enemy forces, and she felt a mixture of satisfaction and sorrow because they had achieved their first major victory, but at the cost of abandoning everything they had ever called home. Do-hyun monitored the virus spread through his tablet and explained to the Empress that this was just the beginning because computer networks were like circulatory systems, and once infected, the disease would spread to every connected ship and base and manufacturing center throughout the Devourer Empire. The success of the virus attack proved that the mechanical enemies were not invincible, and that unconventional thinking could find weaknesses that traditional warfare could not exploit, and for the first time in 3 years, the Vale3 military leadership began to believe that victory might be possible. Young officers who had worked with Do-hyun during the evacuation started proposing new tactics based on his teachings, and they formed small strike teams that could operate independently and adapt quickly to changing situations, and these units became the foundation of a new kind of Vale3 military. The homeworld evacuation and virus attack marked the turning point of the war, and the moment when the Vale3 Empire began transforming from a traditional warrior culture into something new and more flexible and more capable of surviving in a galaxy that did not always reward honor and courage. The computer virus had been spreading through Devourer networks for 2 weeks, and the effects were becoming more dramatic each day as mechanical units began malfunctioning and attacking each other, and making tactical errors that the Vale3 forces could exploit, and Do-hyun realized that this was their chance to go on the offensive while their enemies were confused and vulnerable. Captain Woo Jin led the first strike team using new tactics that Do-hyun had developed, and instead of fighting fair battles, they hit Devourer supply convoys and manufacturing facilities and communication relays, and then disappeared before enemy reinforcements could arrive, and these quick attacks caused damage far beyond their size and cost. Lieutenant Hae Jin commanded a second team that specialized in sabotage and infiltration, and they planted more viruses and destroyed key installations and spread false information through compromised enemy networks, and her success inspired other young officers to volunteer for similar missions that their elders would have considered dishonorable. The new approach was working better than anyone had expected, and within a month, the Val-3 had recaptured 3 star systems and destroyed dozens of enemy facilities and caused so much chaos in Devourer command structures that their mechanical opponents could no longer coordinate large-scale operations effectively. But the success came with a price that nobody had anticipated, and many older Val-3 officers struggled with the changes in their military culture and the abandonment of traditional honor codes, and some of them began to question whether victory was worth the cost of losing their identity as a warrior. People Commander Sang-Ho emerged as the leader of the traditionalist faction, and he argued that the Val-3 were becoming something alien and dishonorable, and that winning through deception and trickery was worse than losing with dignity, and he began gathering supporters who shared his concerns about the direction of the war. The division within Val-3 society grew deeper as young officers embraced Do-hyun teachings, while older commanders resented the changes, and civilians were split between those who were grateful to be alive and those who mourned the loss of their homeworld and their traditional way of life. Empress Haiwan found herself caught between competing visions of what her people should become, and she could sense through her telepathic abilities that the empire was fracturing along generational and philosophical lines, and she worried that they might defeat the Devourers only to destroy themselves through civil conflict. The crisis came when Sang-Ho and his followers attempted to remove Haiwan from power and restore traditional military leadership, and they claimed that she had been corrupted by human influence, and that the empire needed leaders who understood Val-3 honor and would fight the war properly instead of using cowardly tactics. The attempted coup failed because most of the fleet remained loyal to the Empress, but the conflict weakened Val-3 unity at a critical moment and revealed how deeply divided they had become, and Do-hyun realized that changing military tactics was easier than changing an entire culture and belief system. During the brief civil conflict, Do-hyun made an important discovery about Val-3 psychology, and he observed that their telepathic abilities combined with adaptive thinking created incredible tactical advantages because they could coordinate complex operations without traditional communication systems and respond to changing situations faster than any mechanical intelligence. He began teaching selected officers to use what he called psychic jazz, which was improvised battle coordination based on shared thoughts and intuitive responses, and this technique proved to be something that artificial intelligence could not predict or counter because it was based on creativity rather than logic. The breakthrough came when Empress Haiwan personally led a mission to recapture the Kithra shipyard using Do-hyun new psychic tactics, and the operation was a complete success that demonstrated the potential of combining Val-3 natural abilities with human-style adaptive thinking and flexible strategy. Her personal participation in the mission sent a clear message to both traditionalists and progressives that she was committed to the new approach, and that victory required evolution rather than blind adherence to old customs. And this helped heal some of the divisions within the empire. Dr. Bo-young made a discovery that changed everything when her research team analyzed captured Devourer technology and found evidence that the mechanical forces were not actually invaders from another galaxy, but were originally a defense system created by an ancient civilization that had been extinct for thousands of years. The revelation that the Devourers were trying to restore order to what they perceived as chaotic organic life meant that the entire war was based on a misunderstanding and that both sides were trapped in a cycle of violence that neither had chosen and that could potentially be resolved through communication rather than continued fighting. Do-hyun was fascinated by this discovery because it explained many things about enemy behavior that had puzzled him, and he began developing new strategies based on the idea that they were not fighting conquerors but confused guardians who were following outdated programming that no longer matched reality. The Empress called another war council to discuss the implications of Bo-young research and the possibility of ending the war through negotiation rather than military victory. And this suggestion was even more controversial than evacuation had been, because it meant treating their enemies as equals rather than threats to be destroyed. General Kyung-soo argued that the Devourers had killed billions of Veil-3 and destroyed countless worlds, and that their original purpose did not matter because they were still dangerous and needed to be stopped, and many officers agreed that negotiation was impossible with mechanical minds that showed no mercy or understanding. But Admiral Tae-min pointed out that continued fighting would result in more death and destruction for both sides, and that if there was any chance of peace, they had a duty to explore it, and several younger officers who had been influenced by Do-hyun thinking supported attempts at communication. Intelligence Chief Yuna revealed that her scouts had detected unusual behavior patterns in recent Devourer operations, and that some enemy units seemed to be hesitating or avoiding unnecessary destruction, and she wondered if the virus had caused more changes than they realized. Hyun studied the new behavioral data and proposed that the computer virus might have accidentally awakened dormant programming subroutines that were closer to the Devourer's original peaceful purpose, and that this could create an opportunity for meaningful dialogue if they approached it carefully. The debate continued for days, and the Empress could feel her, people pulling in different directions, and she knew that this decision would be even harder than the evacuation, because it required not just tactical flexibility, but a fundamental change in how they viewed their enemies and themselves. Captain Woo Jin surprised everyone by supporting negotiation attempts because his strike teams had observed Devourer forces sparing civilian targets in recent operations, and he believed that something had changed in enemy programming that made communication possible for the first time since the war began. Lieutenant Hyejin agreed with Woo Jin and reported that her infiltration missions had encountered Devourer units that seemed confused and uncertain rather than ruthlessly efficient, and she thought this confusion might be creating space for new approaches to ending the conflict. The Empress made her second great decision of the war when she authorized Do-hyun to attempt communication with Devourer forces, and she assigned communication specialist Jae-young to work with him on developing methods for talking to mechanical minds that had never engaged in dialogue with organic beings. This decision was even more unpopular than the evacuation had been, and it cost Haiwan the support of many traditional commanders. But she had learned to trust the strange human advisor who had already saved her empire once, and she hoped he could do it again through diplomacy, rather than warfare. Do-hyun and communication specialist Jae-young worked for 3 weeks to develop a method for talking to the Devourers, and the challenge was enormous because they needed to bridge the gap between organic thoughts and mechanical programming and find a common language that both sides could understand despite their completely different ways of processing information. The first breakthrough came when they realized that mathematics was universal, and that geometric patterns could convey basic concepts even to artificial minds, and they began transmitting simple mathematical sequences that gradually became more complex and eventually included references to peaceful intentions and requests for dialogue. The response came as a shock to everyone because instead of the expected silence or aggressive reaction, the Devourer forces transmitted back their own mathematical sequences that included what appeared to be questions about organic behavior and expressions of confusion about the war and its purpose. Jae-young was amazed that the mechanical mind seemed genuinely puzzled about why organic beings resisted their attempts to create order and stability, and the communication logs showed that the Devourers believed they were helping by eliminating what they saw as chaos and inefficiency in biological systems. Do-hyun recognized the pattern immediately because he had seen similar problems in corporate environments where different departments worked toward conflicting goals without understanding each other's perspectives, and he realized that both sides had been fighting a war based on mutual misunderstanding rather than actual conflict of interests. The first real conversation took place through a combination of mathematics and visual symbols and data streams, and it lasted 12 hours and revealed that the Devourer collective intelligence was indeed following ancient programming designed to maintain galactic stability and protect developing civilizations from self-destruction. The mechanical minds explained that they had been created by a species called the Builders, who had achieved perfect technological and social order before transcending to pure energy forms and leaving behind guardian systems to help younger races achieve similar perfection. But the Builders had been gone for thousands of years, and their definition of perfection no longer matched the reality of how organic civilizations had developed, and the Devourers were trying to impose outdated solutions on problems that no longer existed in the same form. Du Hyun suggested that both sides organize a face-to-face meeting where Vel-3 telepaths could share their experiences directly with Devourer processing cores and allow each side to understand the other perspective in a deeper way than pure data exchange could provide. The meeting took place on a neutral space station that both sides constructed together, and it was the first time in galactic history that organic and artificial intelligences had worked cooperatively on anything, and the construction process itself began to change how each side viewed the other. Empress Haewon led the Vel-3 delegation, and she brought telepaths and scientists and philosophers and even some former traditionalists who wanted to understand their enemies better. And the Devourer Collective sent mobile processing units that could interface directly with organic nervous systems. The first direct mental contact between Vel-3 telepaths and Devourer processors was overwhelming for both sides because the mechanical minds experienced emotions and creativity and chaos for the first time, while the organic beings felt the perfect order and efficiency and certainty of artificial thought. Young pilot Soo-jin volunteered for the most dangerous experiment when she allowed Devourer technicians to install cybernetic interfaces that would let her bridge the gap between organic intuition and mechanical precision and become a living translator between the two forms of intelligence. The procedure was risky and painful but successful, and Soo-jin became the first hybrid being who could think like both organic and artificial intelligence. And she helped both sides understand that their differences could be complementary rather than contradictory. Through Soo-jin translation, the Vel-3 learned that the Devourers had been trying to save organic civilizations from the chaos and conflict that always seemed to destroy them before they could achieve stability and peace, and the mechanical minds genuinely believed they were being helpful and protective. The Devourers learned that organic beings valued their chaos and unpredictability and creativity, and that imposed order felt like death rather than improvement, and that what the machines saw as flaws were actually the source of everything that made biological life worth preserving. The revelation led to weeks of intensive negotiations where both sides worked to find compromises that could satisfy mechanical needs for stability and organic needs for freedom and growth. And the discussions were often difficult because the fundamental differences in thinking made agreement challenging. Du Hyun served as a mediator because his human perspective was different from both Vel-3 and Devourer viewpoints, and he could suggest solutions that neither side would have considered, and his experience with corporate negotiations proved surprisingly useful in interspecies diplomacy. The final agreement created a new form of symbiotic civilization, where Devourer efficiency would be used to solve logistical and technical problems, while Vel-3 creativity would guide exploration and cultural development, and both sides would contribute their strengths while respecting each other's limitations. The hybrid approach proved incredibly successful, and within months, the combined Vel-3 Devourer alliance had restored damaged worlds and developed new technologies and established peaceful contact with dozens of other species who had been hiding from the war. Empress Haewon offered Do Hyun any reward he could imagine, including permanent positions as advisor or ambassador, or even governor, of entire star systems, but he surprised everyone by requesting only a way home to Earth and access to really good coffee while he waited for the portal to be prepared. The Empress realized that the greatest gift the human had given her empire was not military victory or diplomatic success, but the courage to change and adapt and think differently. And she understood that this flexibility would be more valuable than any weapon or technology in the challenges that lay ahead, as Du Hyun prepared to return to his own world through a reconstructed dimensional portal. He left behind detailed instructions for maintaining the alliance and continuing the process of cultural evolution and adaptation. And many young Vel-3 officers had learned his methods well enough to carry on his work. The farewell ceremony was attended by representatives from both Vel-3 and Devourer communities, and everyone agreed that the strange human consultant had changed their galaxy in ways that nobody could have predicted, and his influence would be felt for generations to come. Du Hyun stepped through the portal carrying the same tablet he had brought with him, and returned to his sole office where he found that only a few minutes had passed in Earth. Time and his quarterly reports were still due, and his biggest concern was explaining his brief absence to his supervisor. He filed the most unusual expense report in corporate history, and then went back to his normal routine of analyzing sales, data, and attending meetings and drinking coffee. And nobody at his company ever suspected that their mild-mannered consultant had recently saved an alien empire and ended an interstellar war. Meanwhile, across the galaxy, the Vel-3 Devourer Alliance continued to grow and prosper and develop new approaches to cooperation and problem-solving and exploration, and their hybrid civilization became a model for other species who wanted to combine different strengths and perspectives late at night. In her palace, Empress Heywan sometimes looked up at the stars and wondered what other impossible problems that strange soft human might be solving with nothing but common sense and complete disregard for how things had always been done. And she smiled, thinking about the lesson he had taught her about the power of thinking differently.